Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. 2016 marked a long and violent year in the life of the city of Chicago. 3,550 shootings, 762 murders. That's an average of more than 2 killings every single day. And it's getting worse. This year's death toll marked a 57% increase over the year before. So what is going on in Chicago? Well, to many politicians and activists, the answer is obvious. There are too many guns and not enough restrictions on those guns. But wait, Chicago already has some of the strictest gun control laws in the country, and those laws have not gotten any looser. Could it be that the left's central assumption about crime control is wrong? Joining us now is Joshua Horowitz. He's Executive Director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. Joshua, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So if you look at the numbers, and I have, there doesn't seem to be any direct correlation between gun ownership and acts of violence. So more Americans own guns than they did 20 years ago, a lot more. And there are far more guns per person in America than there were 20 years ago, and the homicide rate has dropped dramatically. If gun control is the answer, how can that be right?
Well, I think we got to talk about some of the assumptions that you made. First of all, gun ownership across the board is not up. Gun ownership concentrated in less individuals is, as you mentioned, owning more and more guns. But here's what's interesting. I think in the last couple of years, you've seen some of the results of our guns everywhere policies in a number of different states, and we're seeing the murder rate and the gun homicide rate go up 14 to 15, and of course 15 to 16. We don't have the final numbers, but we can imagine that gun violence is in fact now going up. So I think we have to sort of look at that and say, what's going on in the United States? Have we loosened gun laws too much? Where are we with that? And I think, as we've discussed, I really believe gun ownership per se has an effect on the suicide rate, but I think that on the homicide rate, you have a much more complex picture.
Well then, but wait, I've been told since I was a child that the reason there are so many murders in places like Detroit and Chicago is because there are not enough gun laws, or they're going across state lines to buy guns. If that's true, if more guns concentrated results in more killings, then why do the states with the loosest gun laws have the lowest murder rates, which is true? Well, New Hampshire, Vermont, Wyoming, Maine, Idaho.
So that's not true. So there are some states that have loose gun laws that have low murder rates, but there are also some states, for instance, Louisiana, Arizona,
South Carolina,
with very lax gun laws and very high homicide rates.
But the highest, but look, I'm not arguing that there's a direct correlation between loose gun laws and low murder rates.
Right.
I'm merely arguing that gun control doesn't make us safer. That's pretty obvious based on the numbers. So why are you still running a gun control program?
Okay, so let me just give you an example. There's a really interesting study out of Missouri recently. Okay, so Missouri gets rid of their gun violence prevention laws, right? So that they have a permit to purchase law and they have some concealed carry restrictions. Those are all gone. And their homicide rate their gun homicide rate goes up 25%. So the evidence is getting closer and closer. We really believe the evidence is showing that in fact, not a group of gun violence prevention laws, in fact, do lower the homicide rate.
Really? And Okay, so Chicago, 3,500 shootings last year,
right?
762 murders. What gun laws would have prevented that?
So Illinois has okay gun laws, okay? So they don't have the best, they don't have the worst. But what they do have is 60% of their guns that end up in crime come from other states. And those other states, of course, think about Wisconsin, Mississippi, Indiana leads the way there, right? So those guns are coming in from those states with weak gun laws, and they're going across borders, and they're ending up in crime in Chicago. So what we really need to do is to make sure that the evidence-based laws that we think work, background checks, et cetera, that we have them on a national basis. Because Illinois is in a...
But hold on. I've just heard this argument. But so New York City has seen a dramatic drop in gun crime, right?
Right, and they have great gun laws.
And it's right south of Vermont, which has the laxest gun laws in America. You could get in a car and drive up there. So why isn't that the same?
Because first of all, New York, first of all, it's the same thing as Illinois, where the crime guns are coming from out of state. But New York lives in a much safer neighborhood, right? So that you have to go quite some distance to get a firearm. You just can't go...
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Because like everyone I know in New York has a weekend home in Vermont. Look, the point is, this stuff doesn't work, and it doesn't work.
I think the evidence shows that it works, and that's important.
Then why isn't it working in Chicago? Really, is the real reason it's all the fault of Indiana?
Really? Let me ask you a question. Do you think we'd be better off in Chicago with more firearms?
It depends. In the hands of whom?
Right.
I would be better off in Chicago with a firearm,
Right.
and yet it's almost impossible for me to get one in Chicago because the laws are so. There are no gun stores in Chicago.
the laws,
I have to what if I have to register it? As if I'm a criminal?
Actually not. Illinois does not have registration. Illinois has licenses.
The city of Chicago does. Yes, it does. You have to buy a license to have a gun.
Illinois has a license. And what you do is you get a license. Actually, it goes for 10 years.
So I have to ask the permission of the authorities. The only point is, for example, I go onto your website and you say one of the big problems is assault rifles. So of the 762 murders in Chicago, how many were committed with assault rifles?
Well, I don't know that actually that's from my website, but let me tell you.
Well, it is. Actually, I have it right here.
So let me explain to you about assault weapons. Assault weapons make killing more lethal, okay? So what we have in that situation is assault weapons have more deaths per shooting. They don't necessarily cause more shootings, but when you use an assault weapon in a crime, you end up with more people dead and more rounds
so in
fired.
Chicago, there are 762 murders last year. How many were committed with so-called assault weapons?
Right, but you know what? That's a small issue.
Well, what's the answer?
Well, I don't know.
But you run a gun control group. I mean, and you're pushing for right here, semi-automatic military-style firearms designed for one person to kill people. Right. So we have the city with one of the highest murder rates in the country. Right. And how many were committed with assault weapons?
But I think the bigger question is how many guns were trafficked without background checks? That's what I spend my day working on. I want to figure out how do we prevent guns from being trafficked. And let me give you another example. We have a terribly weak federally anti-trafficking law right now. And one of the biggest issues, and I'm sure you agree with me, and this is a bipartisan issue, if you are trafficking firearms, there should be a real penalty for it, and there should be federal deterrence. We don't have that in this country, and that's why a number of Republicans and
you haven't sold me. You haven't explained why a state like Vermont or Maine or Idaho or Wyoming or Texas, where I can buy ammunition at a gas station, have such low murder rates.
I'll tell you why. Because their crime rate's low. So
why are the crime? I mean, so in other words, there's no direct correlation. This is the only point I'm making. I realize this is a complex question.
It is very complex.
But gun control is held up by the left as something we could do. We just don't have the will because the evil NRA is stopping us. And the truth is, there are more guns than people in America. If we passed every single law you wanted, do you really think that the murder rate in Chicago would drop?
Yes, I absolutely do.
You really do?
I do because the states that are supplying guns to Chicago would be forced to do background checks. We'd had a trafficking law. It would make it
so
much
criminals. Many of these guns come from theft, as you know, or they're sold between people who don't obey the law. So these people are, by definition, beyond the reach of the law. A little naive to believe that they're going to obey these laws.
I'm not. It's not that. It's on the law-abiding gunner, right? Here's the thing. Right now, you can transfer a firearm completely above board. You can go on, sell it on an internet site or whatever to someone without doing a background check. That person may be a criminal, may not be. But here's the thing. We want to make sure that the law-abiding gun owner is not transferring into the criminal market. The law-abiding gun owner will do the right thing, but it's really the issue of how do we not transfer guns.
Well, what if the law-abiding gun owner wants to own what you called a military-style assault weapon?
Yeah.
Okay. Why can't he do that? And second, what is a military-style assault weapon?
So let me give you the definition first. So it's a centerfire rifle,
right?
Okay, with a detachable magazine. Okay, so above a .22 caliber, centerfire detachable, with a grip below the stock and something on the front to hold it. So those are the definitions of assault weapon.
Well, that's not so different from my .30-06. A deer rifle, so why?
It is different. Do you have a thumbhole stock on that and a detachable magazine and
it's got a detachable magazine.
But does it have all the other items? Now, let me tell you why.
Who cares what the stock is like? I mean, this suggests you don't know much about guns to me.
I think it really matters, and I think maybe you haven't shot. Have you shot an AR-15?
Yeah, I own one.
Okay, great. So what's important about an AR-15? Important about an AR-15 is you can keep your barrel, and you probably can do this, your muzzle on the target round after round after round. You don't have to reload. It's meant to kill people. So here's what I think we should do. If you own one, I think we treat them the same way we treat machine guns. And people, the NRA says all the time, machine guns don't cause any crime. Okay. I believe, and this is a bill introduced by Representative Cicilline from Rhode Island, that we should treat them just like any other Class 3 weapon and have the same
procedure. But it's a distinction without a difference. Let me just ask you one final question. Yeah. What round do you think is deadlier? The .223 that fires from the military-style assault weapon, or the .30-06, or the .30-30 conventional?
Well, I know which one's more. I mean, I know which has more power. So the .30-30 obviously has more power, but .223 goes at a higher velocity. Okay. No, it's serious, and it's meant to be anti-personnel, and you can put lots of them in the cartridge at the same time. 223 is an anti-personnel round. I'm not going to argue with you. Rifle rounds are powerful too. Configure them the way an assault weapon, and you create something that's much more lethal.
The data don't show that at all. But it's nice to have you on. Thank you for your game defense.
I hope I get back someday.
Nice to see you. All right. President-elect Trump is planning to face off with reporters. He tweeted about it moments ago. Correspondent Peter Ducey is live, as he often is, outside Trump Tower in New York City. Peter?
And Tucker, the next president, has had many press availabilities where he answers a question or two on his way in or out of an event, but he has not had a full-blown press conference until, now we know, January 11th. He just announced, I will be having a general news conference on January 11th in NYC. Thank you. Remember, last month he had teased us with a press conference that was going to be a time for him to stand there with his adult children and announce what he was going to do with his business interests. This says that it is a general press conference. We don't know exactly, we don't know anything else about it, just from the tweet. So that is 1 week from now, and it comes a few hours after we learn that 2017 starts with one American car company in the president-elect's good graces, and one of them really not, because this morning there was a shot on social media. The @RealDonaldTrump account said General Motors is sending Mexican-made model of Chevy Cruze to U.S. car dealers tax-free across border. Make in USA or pay big border tax. Well, GM realized they may have a problem, so they quickly responded like this. General Motors manufactures the Chevrolet Cruze sedan in Lordstown, Ohio. All Chevrolet Cruze sedans sold in the U.S. are built in GM's assembly plant in Lordstown, Ohio. GM builds the Chevrolet Cruze hatchback for global markets in Mexico, with a small number sold in the U.S. Well, another American company, Ford, is actually doing something now that the president-elect called on them to do as a candidate, and that is stop building a factory in Mexico and invest more money here in the States. Ford's CEO says the automaker is no longer going to build a new facility in Mexico, instead pumping $700 million into a Michigan factory, saving 700 jobs, something Ford's president says was done with the next president's policies in mind.
When we look at some of the tax and regulatory reforms that he's been talking about, that gives us a lot of confidence, and this is a vote of confidence that he can deliver on those things.
All this action is happening, of course, before Mr. Trump has taken the oath of office, and we learned today that two of his predecessors have RSVP'd for inauguration festivities. That would be George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and the person that Democrats were hoping would have their hand on the Bible that day, getting sworn in, Hillary Clinton, going to be there on the front steps of the Capitol, too. Tucker?
Peter Ducey, live in Midtown Manhattan outside Trump Tower. Thanks, Peter. President Obama imposed sanctions on Russia recently in response to allegations that the Russian president hacked the election, as they're putting it. Not all Republicans disagreed with that. In fact, some said President Obama didn't go far enough with those sanctions. That group includes Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, a member of the Senate Intelligence and Armed Services Committees. He joins us now from the Russell Rotunda in the U.S. Capitol. Senator, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tucker. Happy New Year to you and your viewers.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you. So the president imposed these sanctions and expelled those 35 Russian diplomats in part because he believed what a lot of people in Washington believe, which is that Vladimir Putin weighed in order to help President-elect Trump get elected. And yet we're hearing now from people who would know that that's not a certainty. So here is the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence yesterday. He said, and I'm quoting, "There's no proof we have from intelligence sources I've seen that show the Russians were directly trying to help Trump." Then this morning, Jim Woolsey, the former CIA director, said this morning that it's not at all clear that Russia did this, and if it did, that it acted alone. So my question is simple. Do we know enough to act in the way we have with Russia, to impose these sanctions and expel the diplomats?
Tucker, I don't think we know enough yet about exactly what happened with the hacking of the DNC and the dissemination of those emails. Now, I have called for a long time for us to take a firmer line with Russia. So while I think the president took some good initial steps last week, it's not specifically about the hacking of the DNC. It's about Russia's behavior for the last 8 years. Why did they think they could get away with doing something like hacking into the DNC? It's because President Obama has consistently looked the other way on their aggression. Remember, just months after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, President Obama came to office and they pressed the reset button with Vladimir Putin. In the middle of his campaign in 2012, he promised the Russian president to wait till after the election he'd have more flexibility. And then when Mitt Romney called Russia one of our #1 geopolitical adversaries, he laughed and mocked him in a debate. All these things are reasons why Vladimir Putin thinks he can get away with acting contrary to the U.S. interest. He ought not, or Russia ought not to have hacked into the DNC. They ought to pay a price for that, a stiffer price than they have. However, if you were to make a list of Russia's crimes and transgressions against the United States and our interest over the last 8 years, that would be way down the list.
So, I mean, I think everything you said is totally defensible. I personally agree with all of it. And yet there is a bigger picture. So Russia is on our side fundamentally in the struggle that most of us recognize is the main one, which is against Islamic extremism. We share common interests. We see this with a lot of other countries. A lot of our allies spy on us. In fact, I think they all do. Israel, Great Britain, Germany. I mean, they've all broken into our computers or spied on us, and we're still allied with them because we have common interests, and we should be. So why wouldn't Russia fall into that category?
Well, all those other countries don't do things like beat our diplomats in Moscow when they're walking in the front door of our embassy. They don't harass our diplomats throughout Russia and throughout the Middle East. They don't invade sovereign countries in Europe like Russia did in Ukraine and like they did in Georgia. They don't supply missiles to rebels that use those missiles to shoot civilian aircraft out of the skies. They don't run illegal spy rings in our countries for decades or then expose. These are just all examples of things that Russia has done over the last 8 years in no small measure because Barack Obama has not just appeased Russia and been weak on Russia, he's actively undermined efforts by people in Congress like me to take a firmer line.
I agree. I mean, I agree with all that, and there's no question that Russia has a many decades-long history of causing mischief around the world and here. I would say that a lot of our allies do run illegal spy rings in our country, as you know, and we look the other way. But it doesn't answer the bigger question, though. Aren't we basically on the same side as the Russians on the question of Islamic terror? It doesn't mean ignoring or excusing their awful behavior, but doesn't that outweigh that behavior?
Well, Tucker, I wish it were so, but if you look at what Russia has done in Syria, they've taken the fight hardly at all to the Islamic State. They fought almost entirely the Syrian opposition that was fighting against Bashar al-Assad. They haven't been bombing Raqqa, the capital of the Islamic State. They've been bombing Aleppo, which is the main opposition was the main opposition holdout until it fell last month. It would be a good thing if Russia would work with the rest of the civilized world to counteract the threat of Islamic extremism, because they have their own Islamic extremists in the Caucasus region. But they simply are not doing that in Syria. They're not doing much of it around the world either.
So one of the explanations for Russia's behavior is the drop, as you know, in oil prices, which has made the country less stable, poorer, more desperate, and countries in that condition tend to act out. We see it with the North Koreans. Won't sanctions potentially exacerbate that? In other words, if Russia becomes even poorer and more cornered, won't its behavior become less predictable and more destructive?
Well, I think the reason that Vladimir Putin has become more aggressive over the last 8 years is that he doesn't have a sense of boundaries from President Obama. You know, this goes back 5 years to his election as president for a third term after he had stepped aside for 4 years and become prime minister. Throughout the 2000s, he enjoyed an oil boom, and that was good for the Russian economy. But over the last 5 years, in his third term, he's had to whip up a nationalist frenzy in Russia. That goes far back before the sanctions related to Ukraine. It goes back before the sanctions that President Obama imposed last week. What we need with Vladimir Putin is a new sense of boundaries. We need to impose new boundaries, and we need to impose cost when he crosses those boundaries. This is something that Ronald Reagan did. Ronald Reagan made the moral case against totalitarian communism in the Soviet Union, but he also did some fundamental things to change the strategic equation, like rebuilding our military, like deploying intermediate range missiles to Europe. Donald Trump promises to do those exact same things. In fact, he promised them in the campaign to rebuild our military and to upgrade our nuclear arsenal and to build missile defenses. Hillary Clinton is the one that was promising policies in the campaign that actually would have emboldened Russia and given them even more strategic advantage.
But I mean, Trump's out there basically saying nice things about Vladimir Putin on Twitter as an avowed, opponent of Putin, someone who thinks that sanctions should be even tougher. Does that bother you?
Well, I think Donald Trump views Russia and China and most other countries fundamentally from an American standpoint that we need to have a firmer line. We need to represent American interests. That's why he often uses the phrase "America first." Ultimately, you often have to sit down and negotiate with your worst adversaries, and those adversaries are often pretty bad actors. Ronald Reagan, after the build-up and after drawing a firm line in his first administration, sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev, negotiated some pretty far-reaching treaties, and ultimately that helped lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
That's
I think
true.
it's important to take a firm line. It's important to take a firm line with all of our adversaries. That doesn't mean in the end, though, that you can't negotiate from a position of strength when you have genuine overlapping interest or you have something you can genuinely bargain for. For 8 years, though, Barack Obama has simply looked the other way. He's tried to hold back people in the Congress who want to impose boundaries on Russia, and he's given away the shop to Russia.
Senator Cotton, thanks a lot for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.
And now it's time for Twitter Storm, our nightly forecast of social media's most powerful weather patterns. Tonight, the eye of the storm on Bill and Hillary Clinton, who reportedly will attend the new president's inauguration later this month. The news was met with mixed reaction on Twitter. Bucky Breeder wrote this: "I am so pleasantly surprised at adult behavior from the Clintons that I won't say anything snarky." Shocked into silence. Roger Kemp tweeted this: "You can't win the election to be inaugurated. I guess being a spectator is second best." Carolyn wrote, "Yuck, why? Are there donors they can fleece? What possible good can they do?" Again, yuck. Truth Hurts tweeted, "And I will be attending my root canal." Bill Perkins wrote, "Are they sure they're invited?" Alice Hart tweeted, "Wow, I didn't expect that. I respect people who get back up after being defeated." And finally, Silk Stone wrote, "Thank you for setting the example. Maybe other Democrats will follow." Maybe. That's tonight's Twitter Storm. Healthcare prices are spiraling out of control, of course. One former hospital head says he knows why they are. Shady business practices that in any other industry would qualify as fraud. You'll meet him in just a minute. Donald Trump has promised that as president, he will repeal and replace Obamacare, and the public largely agrees that he ought to. Many Americans have found the Affordable Care Act not so affordable after all. Stephen Weissman is a lawyer and the former president of a hospital in Miami. He's thought a lot about why going to the doctor is so expensive. He's got some ideas. Recently, he sent the president-elect a petition suggesting what he can do about it, and he joins us now. Mr. Weissman, thanks a lot for coming on. So,
thank you, Tucker. Great to be here.
You've written that the normal critique of healthcare, that there's no price transparency, is not exactly right. Your point is there's really no pricing at all, no legitimate pricing at all, and what many healthcare companies are doing is practicing a species of fraud, as you said. Explain how that works.
Well, that's exactly correct, Tucker. There's actually no pricing in healthcare. As everybody watching the show knows, that when you ask the price of any healthcare procedure, anything from a lab, a physician, or a hospital, you only get one answer. That is, what insurance do you have? Right. And your neighbor may be paying 10 times what you're paying or 1/10 of what you're paying, depending on the insurance company and whether or not they have insurance. Now, there's no other business in the United States that I'm aware of that you could get away with that kind of a business practice. I mean, if anybody walked into their grocery store and paid $1 for a can of tuna fish and then then the neighbor walked in and paid $10, they would understand that there was something wrong. Right. Healthcare, according to the so-called experts that are industry experts, is extremely complicated. So complicated that ordinary people apparently can't understand it. But in reality, I think they've sold the country a bill of goods, and that healthcare is no different than any other business. What is necessary is that there be legitimate pricing. Healthcare providers should be able to set whatever rate they want, but they've got to set the same place, the same hospital has to charge everybody the same price. And what that does, Tucker, is a revolution in healthcare and a dramatic reduction in healthcare prices. Because, first of all, networks become completely obsolete. You should be able to go on. You don't need a network to get a fair price. You will be able to Google the price of any procedure in the United States and determine the price. And then health insurance should become like real insurance, like ordinary insurance that we used to. Take, for example, homeowners insurance. When your house burns down, any kind of insurance. I'm just using as an example homeowners, but when your house burns down and you're shopping around and you want to find some bricks and some drywall and some paint and cement. Nobody says, what insurance do you have? You get the best price you can find and you buy it.
Right.
But right now, consumers in the United States are totally helpless. They can't shop. And the so-called transparency ideas are not going to help.
Wait, but
so
wait, hold on. Can I stop you there? This wasn't supposed to be this way. I was there when the debate over healthcare happened, and technology was supposed to save us from a lot of this, remember? And Republicans promised that too. It's going to make the system more efficient and more transparent. But that didn't happen.
Well, I'll tell you what's so shocking about technology. Throughout the last several decades, for example, the utilization of hospitals has dropped because of technology. Because now you can go in the morning for a gallbladder operation and you're out in the afternoon. You used to be hospitalized for 5, 6, 7 days. So hospital utilization in the United States, right now, the occupancy rate in hospitals is about 60%. 40% of the beds are empty. In any other industry, you'd see a sale. You should be going on, there ought to be a price line for hospitals. But,
well, exactly.
But price is completely irrelevant. It's not a factor. You get a new medical practitioner, physician, comes out of medical school, opening a new practice, wants to build a thriving practice. He's not going to go out and say healthcare checkups $19.95 to get some business. He can't do it. If an insurance company finds out he's charging $19.95, they're going to say, hey, we're going to cut your reimbursement rates. Medicare may kick him out because he's charging less than Medicare pays. So
it's just so perverse. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I have about 100 more questions for you. Our viewers, if they're interested in following up, where can they find your petition online and read in more detail about your plan to fix this?
The petition is on change.org, and it's called End Predatory Healthcare Pricing.
Okay, and we're going to put it on our Facebook page right after the show. Stephen Weissman, thanks a lot for coming on. It's really interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Well, one political analyst has a message to Democrats and a warning to President-elect Trump. You'll hear them both coming up.
Half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
You have a campaign like Mr. Trump's, where the cornerstone of his campaign is based on bigotry and trying to divide us up.
What he brings to my country, what he's awakened in my country, is bigotry and distrust.
The bigotry and the racism and the ignorance and the incitement to violence that he's been encouraging in people.
The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
Well, there's one thing all the smart people agree on, from Lena Dunham to Bill Clinton. It's that Donald Trump won in November because America is a very bad place, filled with very bad people, racists, mouth breathers, the entire cast of Deliverance, basically. Well, political scientist David Paul Kuhn heard that explanation and decided to dig deeper. The result is a recent op-ed in the New York Times. The title of it says it all. Sorry, liberals, bigotry did not elect Trump. He joins us now. David Kuhn, great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
I have to say my favorite was Chelsea Handler saying that Trump was so sexist she needed to move to Spain, which is less sexist. Hilarious. Anyway, you looked into this really article of faith that Trump got elected because America is retrograde and bigoted, and you found what?
He didn't get elected for that reason. If you, for example, take the voters, about a fifth of voters, tens of millions, did not approve of Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, but they went overwhelmingly for Trump. Why? Because he was the challenge to the status quo that Hillary Clinton embodied. And This sort of brings up larger issues, right? Because we've seen this story before, right? The Republicans win the White House, and the explanation that's given is that it's sexism, it's bigotry, it's the worst in Republican voters. But of course, that's the equivalent of, in business terms, of a company saying, you're not buying our product, it's got to be the consumer's fault. But you don't see companies do that. You don't see companies blaming the consumer. It's bad marketing. It's also perhaps clearly bad strategy.
Yeah, New Coke failed because Americans have no palate. It's not a good answer. So you make a really good point, I thought, in this piece about basically the current condition of the Democratic Party, which is really weaker than many of us recognize. The Obama years, popular as he is as a person, have been devastating to his party. And you point the finger at his abandoning his economic message early on and instead focusing on health care.
That's critical. 8 years ago yesterday, I wrote an essay for Real Clear Politics, basically undermining the hype about Barack Obama. All the hype, if we recall, was that he remade our politics, he remade the electoral map. But if you actually looked at the data, his mandate, his majority support followed the stock market crash. The issue that gave him his mandate was the Great Recession. When did he start losing the white support that he gained, the historic white support for any Democrats since 1980? It was in the summer as the healthcare debate began to consume the agenda. What happened to all those promises and those whispers in late 2008 about a New Deal? It didn't happen. So why did Barack Obama then, by 2010, and his party suffer historic congressional losses? Well, it was because they didn't dance with the issue that brought them there. And of course, that's a shot across the bow and a warning to Donald Trump that he has to heed the issues that gave him the White House.
That's right. He's got to make good on his economic promises. Why, I wonder, it seems like an obvious point. I think it's a correct point. There are a lot of smart people in the Democratic Party, and yet none of them prevailed upon Hillary to come up with a coherent economic message. And you see that with a bunch of Democratic politicians. Why? Why wouldn't they do that?
They thought that the making of a modern Democratic president was identity politics. Appeal to enough Hispanic voters, enough African American voters, enough Norwegian bicyclists, and you'll be the president of the United States because the demographics are on your side. The problem is, for all the hype about political machinations and about GOTV efforts and data on your iPhone that can find the voter, at the bar across the street, the fact is, if you don't have a good message and you don't have an inspiring candidate, you're not going to inspire voters. And that fundamentally is what explains, for example, why African American turnout went down in the 2016 race, and why, for example, the white working class on the opposite end of the spectrum effectively in droves left the party that long left them.
Yeah. Though I don't think there's any question that Hillary got the overwhelming majority of Norwegian bicyclists. I haven't checked, but I'm pretty sure that's right. David Paul Kuhn, thanks a lot. That was really smart.
Thanks,
Good
Doctor.
To see you. Well, if it wasn't Trump's racist supporters, it must have been the Clinton campaign emails released by WikiLeaks. That's the explanation of the week. My colleague Sean Hannity interviewed Julian Assange. She's the founder of WikiLeaks, of course. That interview airs tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern. Here's what he told Sean, though, about the effect of those leaks on the election. Watch.
Did it change the outcome? Who knows? It's absolutely impossible to tell. But if it did, the accusation is that the true statements of Hillary Clinton and her campaign manager, John Podesta, and the DNC head, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, their true statements is what changed the election.
There's a lot of news in the interview. Sean went all the way to London to do it. You can see it tonight, a couple hours from now, 10 p.m. Hannity, it's worth it. And one of the fiercest anti-Putin activists, chess master Garry Kasparov, is here next. He says he knows what the real problem is between Russia and the U.S. Well, the White House has imposed sanctions on the Russians for allegedly meddling in our election. But our next guest, Garry Kasparov, says the U.S. doesn't have a problem with Russia. We've got a problem with Putin. Kasparov is what they used to call a man of parts. He's one of the greatest chess players literally in the history of the game. He's the chairman of the Human Rights Foundation. He's the author of a new book called Winter is Coming: Why Vladimir Putin and the Enemies of the Free World Must Be Stopped, a self-explanatory title, and he joins us now. Garry, it's great to see you.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I respect the work that you do fighting for democracy in Russia. I think it's worthy, and I understand why, as a Russian, you're very upset about the autocracy of Vladimir Putin. My question is, as an American, why should I be as concerned? Why should I see Russia as a threat to the United States?
Oh, you have to see Russia as a threat to the United States, Putin's Russia as a threat to the United States, because it harms America worldwide. And eventually, you're now experiencing some of Putin's KGB medicine here in the United States. Hacking into American political system sends a signal to your allies and foes alike in the world that America is weak. America cannot protect even its own borders.
John Podesta's email is not the same as our political system.
Look, Tucker, we're talking about perception becoming a reality. People worldwide, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, they don't understand the difference. DNC, John Podesta emails, all they know is that Vladimir Putin's ran the KGB operation that somehow meddled, interfered with American elections. And they also now understand that, for many years, America under Barack Obama refrained from addressing this issue, addressing this threat, and the retaliation was too little and too late.
So the real cost is that in the eyes of people in Gambia and Burma and Buenos Aires, we are weak.
Look,
and so
again,
this is
don't try my geography. The problem is not, Gambia and Buenos Aires. The problem is France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Baltics, Eastern Europe, Turkey. The price that America will pay for an attempt to walk away, by the way, that's what we did, would be huge. It's this Obama's foreign policy was a failure. And Senator Cotton, in your show a few minutes ago, described, all these actions against the U.S. interest that Putin conducted, and he deserved, of course, to be punished much earlier. But the problem is that if you try now to reward Putin with a grand bargain deal, that will weaken America dramatically. America cannot abandon, its values worldwide and protect it at home.
Well, but we pursued our values pretty vigorously over the past 15 years and wound up in Iraq and Afghanistan and causing untold harm in Libya and didn't really do much for the rest of the Middle East. Maybe we should acknowledge that Russia is primarily a threat to Europe and always has been, and perhaps the European countries ought to be the front line of the defense there and not the United States. Why is that a crazy idea?
Look, are you saying that, America is going to walk away from NATO and its NATO duties?
I don't know. NATO's been around since 1949. Why not reassess it? I mean, is that crazy?
No, you are. No. What are you saying now? It's exactly the reassessment. That's what makes people in the Baltics or in Eastern Europe as a whole, and even in the Scandinavian countries, freaking out.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. I mean, I would be worried too. But as the father of a 19-year-old son, can you explain to me why it's in my interest to send him potentially to go defend the Baltics? I mean, nothing against the Baltics. But isn't that sort of the job of?
I heard it in 1938. Neville Chamberlain also talked about Brits not protecting countries that they couldn't find on the map. Today, I hope the knowledge of geography is much better. And America played its leading role since 1945, and it's defended not only its own borders, but also the free world. And today, so I'm hearing, this very troubling noises, from new administration that, it's a new era where America could walk away, ignoring strategic interests of the free world.
But where does I'm just interested, and we could debate this forever, but just a really simple final question. Where does this obligation that the United States has uniquely among the nations?
Oh, you have no obligations,
Where does that obligation, is that from God, or where does that come from?
No, it comes from American exceptionalism. Should I tell you again? America became the United States. America became great because it defended its values in the first place. And if you want to abandon your global duties, that means that you have to abandon the global economy. And most of American multinational corporations, they benefit dramatically from the global trade. And by the way, so American customers.
China seems to be benefiting a lot from global trade without imposing its values on the rest of the world.
Try to impose tariffs on China and then wait for the next elections when all the prices, consumer prices will go up.
That's a separate debate, but an interesting one. I hope you'll come back for that. Gary Kasparov, a really amazing guy, actually, and it's great to see it, even if I disagree. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, those Amazon Echo devices are supposed to make your life easier, but do they? One family learned a costly lesson from one. We'll tell you what it was next. Plus, Leland Vittert, the great Leland Vittert, ladies and gentlemen, steps into the friend zone. He's here. We'll be right back.